Hello everyone, welcome to another MCAT ACE lecture for the biology and biochemistry section. In today's lecture, we are going to describe different metabolic pathways that are required for energy production. I'm going to split this lecture into two parts. Part 1, which will cover glycolysis, fermentation, citric acid cycle, and electron transport chain. And then in the second part, we will cover the rest of the material that are listed here. And then as always, at the end of the lecture too, we will go over some practice test questions. Alright, so now let's start with glycolysis. Here I'm showing you the fate of the glucose, the main pathways that it will have to go through. And if you know these pathways, you know this lecture pretty well. So for the first part of this lecture, we are going to cover glycolysis, how glucose will be broken down into pyruvate, and then depending on the availability of oxygen, pyruvate can undergo aerobic respiration through the tricyclic acid or citric acid or Krebs cycle, all are the same names. And then from there on, its products will be sent to the electron transport chain to produce ATP. And then if there is not enough oxygen, then the pyruvate will have to undergo anaerobic respiration or fermentation. And we will cover all these reactions in details. And then for the second part of the lecture, we will discuss how glucose can be stored in the form of glycogen, starch, sucrose, or it could undergo the pentose phosphate pathway, also known as hexose monophosphate shunt, in order to produce ribose 5-phosphate and NADPH. And again, we will go over all these pathways in detail, so don't worry about it if there is something that you're not sure about what's going on here. Alright, so starting with glycolysis, its definition is actually breakdown of glucose. And what happens in glycolysis is that glucose through a series of reactions will be broken down into glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and dihydroxyacetone phosphate, or DHAP, dihydroxyacetone phosphate. And these two molecules are isomers and are interchangeable, so therefore we can say that the glucose will give the final product of two molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. And so here, let me erase that for you. So there we go. One glucose molecule that is made of 6 carbon is broken down into 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, each of which is a 3-carbon molecule. So 2 3-carbons will add up to 6 carbon here. And from here on, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate will go through a series of reactions that will yield pyruvate. Alright, now we can split these reactions into two parts. One is the preparatory phase. So here the first section is called preparatory phase, and the reason for that is that these first few reactions will require 2 molecules of ATP, 2 ATP, and then it will give out 2 ADP. And so it's consuming energy in order to get the reaction going. And then in the second phase of the reaction, which is called the payoff phase, each molecule of glyceraldehyde triphosphate will give 2 ATP and 1 NADH. So here we will also have 2 ATP and 1 NADH. And now if you look at all these reactions, 2 ATP was consumed in order to yield 4 ATP and 2 NADH. So we can say that the net reaction of glycolysis is glucose breakdown by adding 2 ATP and 2 NAD plus and 2 phosphate groups to yield 2 pyruvate plus 2 ATP, 2 NADH, 2H plus and 2H2O. So here 4 ATP minus 2 ATP that was initially consumed yields 2 net ATP. And then 1 NADH and another NADH for the second glycerol triphosphate will yield 2 NADH. So this is basically the net reaction that you should be familiar with for the glycolysis. Okay, now that you're familiar with all these reactions, we can move on to describing in details every one of these reactions. And so here I've written the pathway for you and then the fate of the pyruvate in the end. But here it could be a little confusing because I have the rest of the pathway. So what I would like you to do is just to focus on the glycolysis reactions here. Just forget the rest of the stuff that is going on here. And then later on we will cover all the other pathways.